Okay, um, so I'm gonna do another video. It's been interesting lately. The Lord has kind of pointed out um, events, for lack of a better word, events that I've seen, um, everyday experiences, and has used that to kind of teach me um, truth, but in layers. And it's kind of hard to explain, and maybe I'm getting it wrong. I don't know how to exactly explain it, but there's like kind of a initial principle, and then our initial event, circumstance, occurrence, and then from that, the Spirit reveals principles that then it extracts further down. So the similar is like to that video that I released, um, and I'm kind of releasing these videos consecutively, and so I don't know when that will be released. I try not to release a ton of videos at once, and so right for today, I'm recording this on May 1st, but I don't know when it will be released. But anyways, in the other video, I kind of talk about that woman and the boyfriend or friend who was treating her poorly, and then how the Lord kind of drew my attention to that, and then from that, um, revealed principles that I could take away, but then like it was like in successive layers. So, anyways, that's kind of happened today, and it came from watching, well, first listening and watching a video from a protester who, Palestinian protesters, Palestinian liberation protester, whatever you want to call her, standing outside of a building that was taken over by protesters. It was a Columbia building. I'm not sure which building at Columbia University it was, but anyways, it was taken over. So I guess the video was a couple days ago because now the students have been arrested. But in any case, she's standing outside presumably she's standing outside the building, and she's demanding that food be provided, that water be provided. And so, to kind of really paint this picture, you have protesters who have violated the law, entered into a building, which they shouldn't be doing, and now they're demanding that they get food and water because, quote, it's a humanitarian crisis. Now, obviously, on its face, it's just absurd. But if you kind of extract the principle from that, there's something that you can really take away, and this kind of expands further. And what really is going on? Well, it's kind of two things. So we can do it more kind of, I guess, legalistically, because what really is happening is they are committing the crime, and they want to be rewarded in some way or have some reward or, I guess, compensation for committing the crime. But on a more conceptual level, I guess, or a more no, more accurate level, is what's going on is that they have done something which has incurred consequences. Right, when you hold yourself up in a building, um, and especially this building, if you don't have food, and you go in there, you don't have food, well, then you're not going to get food. I mean, you have to leave, but you don't want to leave. So they've held themselves up in a building, and the consequences of doing that is, well, generally you don't get food unless you can provide it your own. But because they couldn't, they wanted someone else to provide the food for them. So what they were doing is they really just wanted to be shielded from their consequence. They wanted to be shielded from the fact that they broke into a building and they shouldn't expect any food unless they can provide food for themselves. But the audacity to ask for the government to provide food when they have broken into someone's building is just absolutely absurd. But even that's the case, so what does this have to do? Okay, I think most of us would agree that that's absurd. What more can we extract from this? And actually, we can extract a little bit more, because what this example shows is how people generally respond to human behavior, and especially, I guess you could say, sin, because what is a major issue right now in our society, and why our society is collapsing, or degrading, put it that way, less strong words. Why it's degrading? One reason is because we have enshrined as a mentality, or at least some people have adopted the mentality of trying to shield people from their consequences. And that's significant because oftentimes it's when you experience a consequence is when you're able to learn something. So actually shielding people from their consequence is unloving to a certain extent, because sometimes the consequence is what a person needs to then learn the lesson. And so we can see in our society right now that a lot of public policy is geared toward those things, and it depends kind of the state that you're in. But depending on the state, and I guess more liberal or progressive states, there are codified laws that try to alleviate people's consequences. So obviously, one of the biggest ones is abortion, where people are wanting to be able to have sex without the consequences, which is possibly getting pregnant, right? And they've actually framed it as, well, if I have to give birth and the state is forcing me to give birth, right? And so they've shifted responsibility to the state entity instead of themselves. And we'll see this with minimum wage laws. We see this with student loan forgiveness. I mean, those are the more salient issues. There's other ones, I'm sure. Just can't think of them off the top of my head. And I don't think um, you all want me to spend, you know, 3 minutes of silence trying to figure it out. But that just kind of gets to the point, right? Is that those policies and those laws are there. I mean, we do it to think that we're helping people, or we're giving them a helping hand or whatever. But what we're really doing is we're shielding them from the consequences of their actions. Because, if you decide to take out, 50,000 a year in tuition for university, and you study, um, I don't know, gender studies, it isn't really going to get you anywhere. And then, so really, the only way with gender studies you're going to go is you have to either get a PhD or a graduate degree, or um, maybe work for some think tank. But I mean, the amount of people that are going to be trying to funnel into a think tank, like you're just not going to have much. It's going to be a bottleneck, is what I'm getting at. And so some people won't be able to get a job with their degree, and so then they end up being a barista at Starbucks or whatever, or some kids drop out. And so they chose to do that. And also the fact that a lot of these people, and I know from my own experiences, they draw out their loans and then they go spend all that money. Well, they spend on tuition, and they also have extra because they draw more than they need. And they go on, spring break trips or whatever, and so they think that they can have the best of both worlds. I think they can just draw out money and then be able to live like they have all the money in the world, or so, or close to that. And so when you forgive student loan and student debt, you're removing that consequences. You're moving people from the consequences of getting themselves into debt and not owning up to their obligation. It's also entirely unjust because entities have lend on the basis that they would be getting paid back. And I'm sure they have money or whatever, but there's still the honesty principle of giving, what's due. And if you borrow from someone, then you are required to pay that back. And if you don't, you're living out of God's law and unjust. But anyways, that's a side note, and I'm on a tangent. But to the point of consequences, and so we do it with minimum wage. or people think that they can, just have a high school education, but have the same standard of living as someone who has a bachelor's degree or even a graduate degree, or someone who has saved money and made sacrifices. And so, what we've done is we've removed those consequences. And by doing that, we've prevented people from being able to learn what they need to learn. And so, one of the things from this video to take away is, you know, since consequences are a teacher, and we actually get that through natural law, right? If I'm doing something, if I touch a hot stove and it burns, that consequence is a lesson: don't touch the hot stove. And sometimes natural law is pretty harsh, and your consequence is losing a limb, um, or being paralyzed, and you realize, okay, maybe what I did was foolish, and I shouldn't have done that. Um, so there's that element or aspect as well, but and then there's also with how we raise and teach other people, especially parents. Um, Obviously, you can't maybe expose the kids to all their consequences, but you can at least expose them to some, right? If they make poor choice, to not shield them from that, because by doing that, you end up shielding them from learning a lot of lessons. And I know my parents, um, out of love, they shielded me from some consequences, stupid choices I made when I was an adolescent. And you know, the question is well, and I have to be fair. Sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't. And I think the moment where I grew the most was those times where I had to face the full, consequence of my choice. And looking back, I am super grateful for it. At the time, I thought they were the worst parents ever, and and so forth. But now, looking back at it, I'm truly grateful, because having those, being exposed to those consequences, I learned, and I didn't learn quickly enough as I should. But over time, I learned and realized, I have to take responsibility. And so, with come to learning from consequences, is this idea of individual responsibility, right? Of taking the ownership and learning for oneself. And so, in our lives, if we want to show love, one way we can show love is by letting people experience their consequences. And I know that sounds contrary to what we think maybe love is. We think love is coming in and helping people and comforting them and not letting them experience pain. But actually, if love is about the benefit of someone, which it is, and a person can be benefited by being exposed to the consequence, then in some sense we should allow the person to be exposed to the consequence. Now, uh, maybe there is some argument that sometimes there we can shield them from a little bit. I mean, I'm not going to get into the nuance there. Everyone's got a brain; they can use it. But as a general principle, we should look at trying to avoid shielding people from their consequence. Um, and that's one way that we can, I think, make that we can radiate light around and show love to the people around us. But then there's also a deeper principle behind individual responsibility, which goes to being an agent versus a non-agent or an object, right? And so that's a big theme in the Doctrine and Covenants, that we are agents to act to ourselves. And part of being an agent is taking on individual responsibility and then acting according to one's understanding. And when you're shielded from consequences, you are you are not giving those learning experiences, and you rely on the person to shield you to continue to shield you. And so you're giving up some of your agency in that process. But then, even taking a step further, I'm reading some apocryphal works, and it's interesting that they talk about the formation of the universe. And one of the things they talk about is how God formed the universe by starting from the inner to the outer. And if you read the scriptures, there's a big theme that goes on all the time, right? Paul talks about the inner change of the man, that we put on the, I think, put on Christ. But there's something better that he says, I think, but I can't recall this time. put on the Christ, but then it put, oh, well, he talks about renewing, the renewing of the mind, right? The renewing of the inner self. Same with King Benjamin talks about the interchange that someone has, and then through the interchange they start to do good things. And I've talked about it a few times, but what this apocryphal work says is that when God created the universe, He started from the inner. And I imagine like from the inner atom, the smallest kind of organism, and organized that, and then worked outward to then create what we have now. And what's interesting, and I feel impressed to share, is as I was pondering that, the Lord then spoke to me and gave me some um, revelation. And this is what He said. He said, organization of the cosmos slash creation is a process of imposing light, parentheses, energy, into the inner and then working outward. Energy is imposed onto the smallest particle and then organized from there outward with all things forming. Creation can only come this way. This is why progressive ideology fails and will always lead to death and chaos, because it reverses the process. It tries to order from the outward in. Um, so that's something to keep in mind. And so part of that ordering from inward to outward is ordering ourselves by being personally responsible. And you can never create a society if you do it the other way. If you try to shill people away, if you try to, you know, engineer the conditions that can lead to a utopia, you actually will lead to a dystopia. It won't bring about, because it's contrary to the way creation works. It's an inner to outward process. And what's interesting is, as I was getting that revelation, the Lord then impressed upon my mind to read a book that I had saved from Amazon on my Kindle. It was actually just a sample, but the Lord impressed upon me to go back and read that. And now I'm reading that. The author, who is a neuroscientist, I believe, is making the case that this inner to outward is actually being supported by science, and that the science is showing that um, uh, the universe wasn't. I mean, obviously, as Christians, or believers in God, we don't think it was just out of chance. But there's now science backing that the view that life has, the creation of life was an inevitable process in a complex system involving, I'm going to butcher the name, dissipative structures and so forth. Basically, like the whole universe started from a little thing, and it was the creation is an inevitable thing, starting from the inward to the outward, going back to what that apocryphal work was saying. And so, again, this idea I think is true, and the fact that the Lord is kind of directing me to these things kind of shows you, or shows me that that is true. And so, take into consideration, look at your life, look at I guess even the policies you support, the politicians, the leaders, and do those leaders, what policies do they promote? Do they promote policies that are focused on individual responsibility to allow people to grow and learn, or is it about sheltering, hiding, and protecting people from those consequences? Because that is a big determination of whether something is good or evil. So discern wisely.